exchanging pieces. An exchange is the capture of one of your opponent's pieces or pawns in return for one of your own. The units exchanged are usually of equivalent value, but not always. If you capture an enemy rook with a rook of your own and your opponent takes your rook in turn, you have exchanged rooks. Since each rook is equivalent to about 5 pawns, it's an even trade. If you capture the enemy queen and your opponent captures your queen, you have exchanged queens. Queens are worth about 9 pawns each. If you give up a bishop and gain one back, you have exchanged bishops. If you lose a knight and win an enemy knight, you have exchanged knights. Bishops and knights are minor pieces worth about 3 pawns each. Even though bishops are preferred to knights in most positions, the two minor pieces are virtually equivalent. So if you give up a bishop but get a knight, you have exchanged minor pieces. Trading up and down, but if you give up a minor piece and gain a rook, you have not made an even exchange. You have won material. This is called winning the exchange. If you give up a rook and gain a minor piece, you have lost the exchange. Obviously, if you lose a pawn and gain a pawn, you have made an even exchange. If you give up a bishop and get 3 pawns in exchange for it, this, too, is an even trade. But most of the time, when we talk about trading or exchanging pieces, we mean queen for queen, rook for rook, minor piece for minor piece. The strategy of exchanging pieces is often a factor in determining strategy. In the course of a game, circumstances develop in which exchanges become feasible. You will have to decide whether to make or avoid these possible exchanges, based on your analysis of the position, and whether an exchange will improve or impair your situation. You should consider various critical factors. In an endgame, you will want to trade if doing so will enable you to win by promoting a pawn, as in diagram 59. White has a winning simplification. White could protect his attack pawn by moving the bishop to h3, but black's knight would then go to c7, capturing the pawn a move later. Instead, white takes the knight, and black's king takes the bishop, a trade of minor pieces. But now white's e-pawn can advance to the queening square unmolested. Behind by a pawn, in the endgame, if you are behind by a pawn or two, it is sometimes possible to reach a positional draw by exchanging pieces. Diagram 60 shows such a possibility. White simplifies to a positional draw. Black has some chances to win because of his 2 extra pawns. But white can prevent those pawns from moving safely by exchanging the a3 bishop for the knight. After black's king takes back on d6, white's king goes to g2 and to f3 a move later. Black will then not be able to push either of his pawns without losing it, for white's king and bishop both guard the squares in front of the pawns. Should bishops be idle? Black's bishop, meanwhile, can only watch idly. Since it is a dark square bishop, it could guard either e4 or d3, both light squares. The players have bishops of opposite color, which usually means a draw. A player with an inferior position should consider trading pieces if it leads to a drawn position based on opposite color bishops. When not to trade, if you want to increase the pressure, don't trade pieces if doing so would release the tension. Diagram 61 is an example of such a situation. White to move. Don't exchange. In this position, if white's d3 pawn captures black's e4 pawn, black's knight can take back, keeping the game equal in material. But it's too soon to capture. First interposing the move bishop to a3 is stronger. This move pins the black knight and threatens to capture it for nothing. Black is compelled to defend the knight with the d-pawn, moving it to d6. White's bishop then takes the knight, and black's d6 pawn takes back. Now, finally, white's d3 pawn captures on e4. If black's f5 pawn takes back, white's f2 knight makes the final capture on e4, putting white ahead by a pawn. Thus, in diagram 61, it is better to delay capturing on e4. The capture is much stronger after white improves his position. Trading in time. Another reason to trade pieces is to gain time. Time is usually measured by initiative and development. You gain time by forcing your opponent to lose time or by completing an action in the fewest possible moves. When you start an exchange, your opponent is usually forced to respond by taking back. This means that your opponent could not, white trades to gain time, proceed with his own plans, at least for the moment, and that it is, again, your turn to do what you want. For now, you have the initiative. But remember, you may not want to capture first if it releases the pressure or if you have a better move instead. In diagram 62, white's knight and g4 pawn are both menaced. White's knight is protecting the g-pawn. If white moves the knight to safety, white will lose his g-pawn immediately. If white protects the knight with his king, black will trade knights and then capture white's g-pawn with his h-pawn. White can deal with the threats both to his knight and to his g-pawn with a gain of time by initiating the exchange of knights. After white's knight takes on c4, black must take back to avoid material loss. White thus gains time to capture and win the h-pawn. Note that white could not take the h-pawn immediately, because his knight was threatened. Losing time, trading pieces doesn't always gain time. Sometimes it loses time, as in diagram 63. White to move. The bishop shouldn't take the b8 knight. If white's f4 bishop captures the knight on b8, white loses time. To get to b8 to capture the knight, white's bishop will have used 2 moves from its starting square on cl to f4, then to b8. The knight didn't move at all, and now it never will. Black will have to recapture on b8, of course, probably with the a8 rook. So white has spent 2 moves to take the knight, black only 1 to recapture, a net loss of 1 move for white. But that's not all. Notice that in diagram 63 both sides have developed 3 minor pieces and that black has already castled. In diagram 64, which shows the position after the exchange of bishop for knight, white has only 2 developed pieces, black 4. Thus the exchange was clearly a loss of time for white. White has lost time. Don't trade while attacking. If you have a menacing attack, you should avoid exchanges until the enemy is forced to make significant concessions or to yield concrete advantages, such as giving up material or weakening his pawn structure. The reason is that the number of threats closely corresponds to the size of the invading army, so careless trades can dilute your attacking chances. In diagram 65, white shouldn't trade queens. White to move shouldn't trade queens. White to move could trade queens here, but that would be a mistake. White's attack is strong enough to win the enemy queen, or give checkmate, so why trade queens? By moving his queen to h3, for example, white threatens to win the rook at c8 and also to pin black's queen along the g-file with his rook. So even though white is ahead materially and normally should trade pieces, here it makes more sense to avoid the trade and to press the attack. You're on the opposite side of the coin when you're under attack. In such cases, you should seek trades to lessen the severity of your opponent's assault. In diagram 66, black can force a trade of queens and avoid mate. White is threatening mate with the queen at either h7 or h8. Black can thwart this plan by checking at g5 with his queen. If white takes black's queen, black's bishop recaptures and mate is averted. If white doesn't take black's queen, black takes white's queen next move and the mate threat is stopped. Black to move can stop mate trade pieces when under attack. With fewer pieces, it is harder to muster an attack. Especially try to trade off queens, the enemy's most potent assault force. White should trade off a few pieces. There is a dominant principle about exchanging pieces. It is to see this principle, to trade when ahead, applies more to pieces than IO pawns. When ahead in material, it's not usually a good idea to trade pawns. For example, when up a pawn, it would be a mistake to trade down to an ending of knight and pawn versus white has avoided mate and has a winning endgame, bishop if the bishop could sacrifice itself for the pawn. Although you would then be up a knight after your opponent's sacrifice, you wouldn't be able to win the game. King and knight versus king is a draw. White to play has a winning game, Diagram 70 shows a situation where offering an exchange of pawns would be the wrong strategy. The correct strategy for white is first to attack the black a-pawn with his king by moving it to b5, then, if necessary, maneuvering the white bishop to attack the a-pawn or to offer a trade of bishops. The wrong idea is to move the b-pawn to b4, offering a trade of pawns and hoping to mobilize the connected pawns. Black will take white's b-pawn with the a-pawn, and white's c-pawn will recapture on b4. Diagram 71. Creating a draw, black to move sets up a positional draw. Black creates a drawn game by taking the b-pawn with the bishop. White's bishop recaptures and black moves his king to d7, heading for the a8 corner. The game is drawn because white will be unable to drive black's king out of the corner. The problem is that white's bishop can't control a8. This type of sacrifice, reducing to a positional draw, would have been impossible if white had kept all his pawns on the board. Win ahead, don't exchange pawns, exchange pieces. The short side, if you are on the short side of the position, behind in material, the principles apply in reverse. Don't trade pieces, trade pawns. Maybe you'll have a chance to sacrifice down to a draw if you've systematically exchanged all pawns when possible.